Tune into a dozen different local news stations across the country on any given evening, and you might hear exactly the same script being read, word for word, by a dozen different anchors. Behind these familiar, trusted faces are massive media conglomerates like the Sinclair Broadcast Group. They purchase hundreds of local stations and feed them pre-packaged talking points, creating a polished veneer of hometown journalism driven by a highly centralized corporate agenda. Alden Global Capital, a secretive hedge fund, has been quietly buying up independent newspapers from coast to coast. Between conglomerates handing down mandatory scripts and hedge funds buying out the printing presses, the local reporter is increasingly acting as a mouthpiece for distant financial giants. Communities are left blind to what is actually happening in their own backyards. When Alden Global Capital acquires a paper like the Chicago Tribune, they execute a highly specific playbook. They immediately slash newsroom staffing to the bone and sell off the underlying real estate, rapidly liquidating the paper's physical and human assets to extract maximum short-term profit. The result is a hollowed-out operation. Historic institutions are reduced to skeleton crews, and the physical distribution of local reporting is left to rot on the sidewalk. This line graph maps the direct, measurable effects of losing that civic infrastructure. As the number of journalists covering a municipality drops, local voter turnout predictably falls. Misinformation spreads quickly, and city budgets bloat as local corruption operates without scrutiny. The economic destruction of local news operates as an active mechanism for local corruption, creating a dark zone where bad actors go unchecked. There are still independent journalists attempting to fill this expanding accountability vacuum, but the moment they step onto the street, they face immediate physical retaliation. According to the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, there has been a sharp spike in reporters being actively targeted by police. Photographers and writers covering protests are routinely kettled, jabbed with batons, and, as we see here, detained and zip-tied by multiple officers simply for documenting events in public spaces. If a reporter or a private citizen manages to avoid physical intimidation, they are often hit with an invisible secondary attack, a strategic lawsuit against public participation, or a SLAPP suit. These are baseless lawsuits filed purely to punish criticism. A politician might sue a constituent over a critical op-ed. In Texas, a pet care company sued a couple for $1 million over a single one-star Yelp review. This chart illustrates the brutal financial logic behind a SLAPP suit. A corporate plaintiff doesn't actually need to win the case. They only need to leverage their massive legal budget to drain a private citizen's savings down to zero through pretrial motions and discovery fees. By pricing the cost of legal defense completely out of reach, powerful entities weaponize the justice system itself to guarantee silence before a trial ever begins. While police target the messengers on the street and lawyers target their bank accounts, governments are choking off the raw data using quiet administrative maneuvers. Access laws like the U.S. Freedom of Information Act or India's Right to Information Act establish clear legal frameworks. As detailed here in Sections 3 and 4, governments are legally obligated to publish financial records, organizational structures, and departmental operations for public review. But state bureaucracies are actively neutralizing these mandates. Recently, India introduced the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, a law that broadly reclassifies public accountability data, like official conduct and expenditure records, as non-disclosable personal information, legally shielding the government from scrutiny. By deceptively rebranding government secrecy as a defense of personal privacy, the state closes the books, protecting its own interests while legally blinding the public. The defense against these multifaceted pressures rely on a set of structural legal shields that have been hardened through decades of litigation. One of the most vital defenses dates back to 1964, when an Alabama police commissioner sued civil rights activists for libel over a newspaper advertisement criticizing the police department. The case, New York Times v. Sullivan, made it all the way to this bench of Supreme Court justices, who ruled unanimously to protect the press from retaliatory claims. The ruling established the actual malice standard. It dictated that to win a libel suit, a public official has to prove that a publisher knew the information was entirely false or acted with reckless disregard for the truth before they hit print. Without that standard, every minor factual error and a sprawling investigative report would result in a fatal financial blow, making rigorous journalism too risky to publish. But today's bad actors have figured out how to bypass the actual malice standard entirely by bleeding defendants dry in pre-trial litigation. To counter this, states are passing a new defensive tool, anti-SLAPP laws. This flowchart breaks down exactly how anti-SLAPP legislation neutralizes a baseless lawsuit. Early in the process, the defendant files a motion to strike. The burden of proof immediately shifts to the plaintiff, who must show they have a high probability of actually winning. If they can't, the case is dismissed. Crucially, the law then triggers a fee-shifting mechanism. The plaintiff who filed the frivolous lawsuit is forced to pay the legal fees of the defendant they tried to bankrupt. Transparency requires constant maintenance. Keeping a democracy out of the dark means fiercely protecting these structural legal shields, ensuring that both vulture capitalism and government overreach remain exposed to the light.